Hi, I'm Jim Pethakoukas of the American Enterprise Institute, and welcome to our event, Has Trumpian Populism Succeeded? Donald Trump's presidency has been a mix of establishment and populist politics. In terms of policy, the president has combined standard Republican tax cuts and deregulation with more restrictionist policies on trade and immigration. And while the president's rhetoric has often been anti-elite, norm-violating, and sometimes inflammatory, he's also won the support of the mainstream Republican Party lawmakers and voters alike. So what are we to make of his presidency? Have President Trump's economic policies been successful? If so, to what degree does populism deserve the credit? And going forward, what lessons should policymakers learn from this recent rise of populism on both the left and right? Today, I'll be discussing these issues with two great guests. First, Casey Mulligan is a professor of economics at the University of Chicago, and he served as chief economist for the Council of Economic Advisors in the Trump administration from September 2018 to August 2019. His most recent book, released just last month, is You're Hired: Untold Successes and Failures of a Populist President. And Michael Strain is the John G. Searle Scholar and Director of Economic Policy Studies here at AEI. He's the author of The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It, released in February of this year. So here's how the event's going to go. To start out, Casey will speak for about 10 minutes, and then Mike will offer a 10-minute response. And after that, we'll have a panel discussion for a while. And toward the end of the discussion, about 10:45, we're going to do a Q&A. So please submit your questions on Twitter with the hashtag AskAEIEcon. All right, with that, Professor Mulligan.
Good morning. I have some slides to share during my presentation. So good morning. I really appreciate AEI organizing this. I'm going to economize on your time today, but you can find a lot more in my new book. And readers have been having fun, but also coming away agreeing at least somewhat that populism has some real substance. So let's start with a definition of populism. In his book, Michael refers to pitting the people against the elites. And the people and the elites are in scare quotes, so I take that to mean that he and others might be skeptical whether these groups actually exist. And as I explain in my book, the elites really do exist as a group, and prove that it's only a slight exaggeration to say that we all know each other. There's one piece of data, even in the Trump White House, the incidence of Harvard graduates is 100 times what it is in the general population. Second, the pitting word, I think, suggests that the conflict is imagined or only manufactured by politicians. To the contrary, this is a real conflict. People have been suffering from significant policy mistakes, which the elites do not acknowledge, let alone fix. In the short time today, I'll give you a couple examples. Drug overdoses tripled over about 10 years, but as various metrics in my book show, Washington remained as oblivious as ever. Federal policy was unwittingly fueling this epidemic with, for example, subsidies up and down the prescription drug supply chain. But at least in the years I showed you, illegal fentanyl did not loom large. During these years and decades before, fentanyl would momentarily come into the US market. And at the time, people would say our drug supply was getting poisoned, but the Department of Justice every time would beat it back. Then in 2013, without any acknowledgement as to what was going on with opioids, the Attorney General did this.
Most intense, where I had these mandatory minimum sentences that I had to impose on people who had drug problems and who were selling, relatively small amount of drugs in a non-violent way to support a drug habit that they had, and who had to go to jail for a 5-year mandatory minimum or a 10-year mandatory minimum. And I didn't feel comfortable doing that.
As Attorney General, Holder announced that he would no longer support mandatory minimums for low-level drug crime.
Immediately, here comes the fentanyl. Immediately, surveys showed record increases in the number of people using illicitly manufactured opioids. The Trump campaign called out the opioid epidemic. This was a major part of the American carnage that Trump cited in his inaugural address, which of course deeply offended the elites. I'll go easy on Michael on this point. So let's instead take Susan Rice's new book, which begins, the very beginning of the book, the opening of the book, she talks about, she heard Trump say American carnage in his address. And that was evidence, she says, of his unthinkable cynicism and ugliness, and how our president was saying farewell to the moral universe. I quote her. She has 534 pages in that book, but not one of them has room to mention the opioid epidemic, drug overdoses, or any real substance behind populism. So let's look closer at the address and at the monthly data. What did the president say in his inaugural address? The crime and the gangs and drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much potential. This American carnage stops right here and right now. Very clearly, once we go back and look what he actually said, he's referring to the drugs and the crime that have stolen too many lives early before the natural death. Now, I admit that the monthly data are noisy, but it sure looks like the carnage did stop exactly when our president said it would. Now, the deaths did not go down to zero, and I'll have more to say about that. But part of what happened in January 2017 is the new attorney general that the president put in rescinded the Holder memo. Although I am concerned that some US attorneys out there are still following the Holder approach. Trump campaigned loudly also against Obamacare's individual mandate specifically and excessive regulation generally. The individual mandate is a classic case where regular people had to suffer under a fundamentally flawed theory from the so-called experts. Another thing they try to do is to force people with beer budgets to have wine tastes. I give many examples in the book, but let's take small dollar loans. As J.D. Vance explains in his best-selling book about flyover country, small dollar loans can be a convenient and valuable product for poor people. They can pay $40 or $50 to get a small short-term loan that allows them to avoid hundreds of dollars in late fees and penalties from banks, landlords, collectors, etc. But the so-called Consumer Finance Protection Bureau puts that $40 in their annual percentage rate formula and concludes that nobody should be allowed to purchase such a service. Never mind the 600,000 consumers who wrote CFPB begging to keep the loans that help them pay, I quote, for rent, childcare, food, vacation, school supplies, car payments, power, utility bills, cell phone bills, credit card bills, groceries, medical bills, insurance premiums, and student educational costs. The last one that I want to show you with the little time that I have is how FDA regulations protected generic drug manufacturers from competition. This is not a question of safety and efficacy because the formula in any generic drug has been in use for many years. The companies rigged the system so that they could charge brand name prices for generic products. President Trump ended that beginning in 2017. This really hurt Chinese and other foreign companies who had previously secured themselves special favors. And Israeli manufacturers' stock crashed, and the analysts readily acknowledged that what was going on was there was more competition in the market for generic drugs stemming from what FDA began doing in 2017. Most important, consumers saw it too. I show here the consumer price index for prescription drugs, and we see that it became negative for the first time in 46 years. Now, I understand that deregulation is a dirty word in certain circles that call themselves populists. Jim called deregulation the standard Republican fare. Well, Trump's FDA deregulation by itself translates into ongoing savings of about 11% on prescription drugs generally, which is a big deal, especially for low-income families. I don't understand why any populist would want to reverse these savings and return to the companies the privileges that excessive regulation created for them. Trump's many regulatory changes add up to real savings. These are my estimates of what it would cost to go back to running the regulatory state the way President Bush and Obama were. I have broken consumers down into 5 income groups. That's each of the bars here. And you can see that the lowest income group would face lower wages and higher expenses, such as the prescription drugs I showed you, that total 15% of their income. That would be like doubling their taxes that they pay. The way I see it, Trump has been a political entrepreneur who figured out how to ride populism into winning the biggest elected position in the world, and then achieving historic policy successes pursuant to some, at least, of his campaign promises. There are failures too. The subtitle of my book is Successes and Failures. So maybe Trump is the political sphere's version of the BlackBerry. Historical progress, but ultimately to be supplanted by something even better. What I can assure you is that the people continue to suffer from significant policy mistakes, and they know it, even while the elites continue to fail to acknowledge and even hiding, as I explain in my book, hiding evidence about their failures. Resting on real fundamentals, populism is not going away, even when Trump does. Thank you.
All right, great. Now we have 10 minutes or so from Dr. Strain.
Apologies, I was muted. Thank you, Casey, for that thoughtful presentation. Let me share my screen so I can get that working. There we go. Okay. Thank you again, Dr. Mulligan, for that thoughtful presentation. And there's a lot in there for sure. And I would encourage everybody to buy Casey's book. You can find it on Amazon and other places as well. It's very thoughtful and certainly worth your time. And regardless of what happens next month, I think Casey's point that populism may be here to stay, and that maybe other iterations of populism following President Trump is certainly a thoughtful thesis and one that all people interested in politics and economics and public policy should read. So I would strongly encourage you to buy Casey's book. My book, The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It. I think you can tell by the subtitle, Casey and I have different views on this question. And so I'm delighted to be having this conversation today, and thank everybody for tuning in, and also thank everybody who will watch the video later on. Let me just dive in here. What is populism? Casey touched on this and quoted me, and I didn't hear Casey's presentation before he gave it. I heard it for the first time with the audience. So you'll see the scare quotes in here around the people and the elites. If I had heard Casey's presentation, I might have taken those out. But let me give a 3-part definition. A political stance aggressively pitting the people against the elites, I think is a key part of any definition of populism. Now, this does not mean that the elites don't exist and the people don't exist, but it does mean that I think that this dichotomy is overdone by populists and by populism. The dichotomy is less strong than I think populists would have you believe. An emphasis on the decency of the people and the corruption of the elites. I think that's an important part of populism, that the elites are rigging the system against the people. That's a common phrase you hear Elizabeth Warren or Senator Sanders use, for example, as well as the president. And then finally, an embrace of pessimism. Things are terrible. The trajectory is bad for the nation and for individuals, and an effort to close the country and to turn inward. Immigrants are the problem. Globalists are the problem. globalization is the problem. We're losing abroad. There's a zero-sum mentality. We need to turn inward, focus on ourselves, and we need to do that because things are really terrible. So that, I think, is the way that I think about populism. So let's talk about Trumpian populism. I think it's important to identify which of the president's initiatives are populist and why. When the president orders scrambled eggs for breakfast, that's not a populist act. Lots of people have scrambled eggs for breakfast, and certainly not everything the president has done is populist. But there are quite a few things that are. The best parts of the president's agenda, Casey talked a lot about one in his presentation, which is deregulation. I think that's been successful. And the 2017 tax law, particularly the corporate tax provisions in that law, I think are very successful, and are the best parts of the president's overall economic policy agenda. I wouldn't include those as populist. I think that reducing the corporate income tax rate is something that Mitt Romney would have done if he were elected. There would have been a lot of pressure on John McCain to do that if he were elected, and that's been a standard goal of Republican and conservative economic policy for quite some time. Deregulation, same thing. Find me a Republican who doesn't think that the U.S. economy is too heavily regulated. So those are certainly parts of the president's policy agenda. They are successful parts of the president's policy agenda, but I wouldn't call them populist. Instead, trade wars, attacks on domestic institutions, attacks on international institutions, attacks on basic norms, hostility toward immigrants, hostility toward immigration. There, I think those components of the president's agenda are populist and meet the definition of populism that I put out at the beginning. In addition, I would argue that the president typically enters the public debate and the discourse as a populist as well, and that's a big part of his presidency. So maybe the component of the president's populist agenda that he's made the most progress on, I think, is the trade war. And so let's just take a look at that in a little more detail. I would argue that the trade war didn't work even on its own terms. The terms of the trade war are the standard terms that are used by Democrats and Republicans who support protectionism, which is that there's this group of workers, these parts of the country that have been neglected by the elites, and the elites are more interested in globalism and more interested in overall economic performance, which presumably will help them, than they are in manufacturing workers in manufacturing towns. And so we need some protectionist policies in order to correct that imbalance. And even if those policies increase consumer prices, slow investment spending, slow overall economic growth, they're worth it because they afford special benefit to this group of neglected workers, in this case, manufacturing workers or certain neglected regions of the country. Casey mentioned the president's inaugural address, American Carnage. The president spoke about hollowed out factory towns. I think the phrase was scattered like tombstones across the nation. This is what we're talking about. You'll recall when the trade war began, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross going on television holding up a can of Campbell's soup and saying, this can will cost you 1.5 cents or 2 cents more than it otherwise would. The idea is that we can spread the pain of the trade war over the entire nation, and it's really not going to be that bad. It's going to cost you an extra penny to buy your can of soup, but that's going to allow significant benefits to flow to manufacturing workers who again deserve special attention. The best piece of evidence I'm aware of that looks at this hypothesis is a 2019 paper by Federal Reserve economists Flahan and Pierce, and they do what seems to be a pretty careful job trying to identify what the effect of the trade war was on manufacturing. And they find that protection from import competition provided by the tariffs does, in isolation, increase manufacturing employment. So looking at that one component, protection from import competition, actually does increase employment by about 0.3% under the measure that they use. But that, of course, is not all that trade wars do. Trade wars also increase the costs businesses face to purchase the goods they need for production, to purchase intermediate goods in the production process. And Flahan and Pierce estimate that effect reduces employment by 1.1%. So even there, the effect of the trade war on employment from increasing the cost of intermediate goods is significantly larger than the positive effect from protection from imports. And of course, trade wars don't just happen. They're wars. There's a tit for tat. The president doesn't just impose tariffs and then that's the end of the story. Nations retaliate, and they also took that into account. So they took into account three factors: protection from imports, increases in the cost of intermediate goods to production, and tit for tat. And they find that overall, manufacturing employment actually was reduced by 1.4%, again under their measure, as a consequence of the trade war. So here again, the trade war didn't work even on the populist terms. The question, has Trumpian populism succeeded? For the trade war, the answer has to be no, because the trade war hurt manufacturing workers, which are the group that the president argued needed special attention. And of course, the trade war had other effects as well: a reduction in the varieties of imported goods that U.S. consumers can enjoy, higher prices that consumers face at the cash register, fewer exports, which hurt export-intensive firms, particularly farms, lower stock returns and higher default risk, which again must be a consequence of the tit for tat. Most of these are pretty well established. Most of the items on this list are pretty well established by existing economics research. Policy uncertainty from the trade war slowed business investment, which worked against the president's signature legislative accomplishment, which was the corporate tax reduction. The president encouraged investment with his right hand by reducing corporate tax rates, and then he discouraged investment with his left hand by starting trade wars. So the spillover effects: not only did Trumpian populism not work for the populist objectives, it also reduced the effectiveness of the president's other objectives. A little example of this uncertainty: we're doing this for the Christmas season. That's a quote from the president. So let's go back to the summer of 2019, which seems like it was 200 or 300 years ago, based on all that's happened in the past few months. In June, the U.S. had been imposing a 25% tariff on $250 billion in Chinese imports, roughly half. Later in the month of June, the president agreed not to impose additional tariffs and to restart trade negotiations with China. Then about 5 weeks later, the president abruptly changed his mind and imposed a 10% tariff on the remaining $300 billion of imports, effective September 1st. Then a few weeks after that, the president said, "Oh, we're not going to do that until December." When asked why, the president said, "We're doing this for the Christmas season." That's kind of a remarkable statement from the president, given that he had spent years telling the American people and telling businesses that the trade war would not have any adverse effect on them. This is an example of the kind of climate that is created when you enter into a trade war. How are businesses supposed to make investment decisions when there's so much uncertainty about what the trade policy regime would be? This, I think, undermined the success of the 2017 tax law, at least for now. But in addition, it undermined the argument that conservative analysts and that economists put forward, which is that that businesses will respond to these incentives. And if we have a President Biden and he raises the corporate tax rate, and people on the right and economists who are more in favor of free markets want to reduce the corporate tax rate again, they're going to have a much harder time doing that because of the president's trade war. let me just say a word about the populist threat over the long term. I think a key part of the president's populism has been to stoke racial, ethnic, and religious animosity. This must have some effect on consumer spending, on business formation, particularly if it's sustained over the longer term. The president has supported protectionism and attacked the post-World War II liberal international order. That's a direct threat to prosperity. Those institutions and that regime have been the bedrock of prosperity on both sides of the Atlantic for 7 decades. And by attacking it and by weakening it, the president risks threatening the foundation of that prosperity, or a foundation of that prosperity. By weakening the rule of law and the cultures and norms reinforcing it, the president has eroded the foundations of a strong economy. By attacking institutions, by labeling the Federal Reserve Chairman as an enemy, the president has weakened public confidence in them. The president's hostility toward immigrants threatens the United States' place as the global destination for many of the world's best, brightest, and most ambitious people. That, of course, has a significant longer run economic effect. The extent to which this damage occurred over the last 4 years, I think, is surprising and considerable. The extent to which it will be lasting, I think, is more of an open question. But all of this, I think, is problematic from an economic perspective, and all of it, I think, flows from the president's populism. These are all manifestations of the populist impulse, and I think that they contribute to my verdict, which is that the Trumpian populism has not succeeded. The foundation of the president's message, Casey referred to the president's inaugural address, American carnage. People have been doing terribly. The country is or many parts of the country are a wasteland. I think it's just not at odds with the facts. It is not in line with the economic record of the past 3 decades, which is something I spend a lot of time on in my book. America is upwardly mobile. Wages and incomes aren't stagnant. Workers do enjoy the fruits of their labor. The game is not rigged. Capitalism is not broken. The president has argued on each of these points that I am wrong. And I believe the evidence suggests that the president is wrong and that populists are wrong. You hear exactly the same charges from populists on the political left as well, from Senator Sanders and Senator Warren. Buy the book, you'll see. I believe we can be confident. Populism is pessimistic. Populism is inward focused. And I think we should be optimistic. And I think we should be outward focused. And we are not in a zero-sum conflict with each other. And we can be open to the world, and we can be confident in the future. And those aren't just sentiments. We can be confident, we should be open, and we are not in a zero-sum conflict because that is what the economic record shows. So thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks a lot, Mike. We'll let Casey sort of respond, but I just want to frame it for a second. I believe what Mike was saying, that the parts of Trumpian populism, which seem to have worked and were good ideas, are really sort of traditional republicanism, corporate tax cuts and deregulation. And the parts of Trumpian populism, which in Mike's view have been failures, the trade war and immigration, that's populism. Much of it sort of reflects the kind of things you also hear on the left a lot about, with hostility to trade and sometimes immigration. So Casey, is Mike right? Is the parts that you really love of Trumpian populism, isn't that just republicanism and conservative economics, tax cuts and deregulation?
Nope. That's the short answer. Now I think if you look, and someone should do a word analysis of Trump's speeches. He's given a lot of speeches. I think you'll find the individual mandate and prescription drugs coming in there way more than trade. If you take all 4 years together, yeah, there have been periods of time where he was more emphasizing on trade, but every other day he is bragging about getting rid of the individual mandate. Now you want to say that's a Republican thing? Okay, I think it came from heritage, but whatever, whatever. The people, and I explained in the book, the way Trump learned that the individual mandate was terrible and he should get rid of it as a leader of the people and not the elites, was to ignore what the experts were saying about how it's needed for adverse selection and all this really terrible analysis. And he was hearing it from the people, not from Washington. And I explained that in the book. Same with the prescription drugs. You hear about that in Washington, but again, they're hearing that from the people. You know, those prescription drug regulations were in there in the Bush administration. He was a Republican last I checked. He had a brother that tried to run for this spot that Trump beat pretty handily. The opioid epidemic, in fact, I explain in the book, that's a bipartisan failures there. Those subsidies up and down the supply chain, a lot of them came in Republicans. In fact, some of the people who worked for Bush on those issues are still in the Trump administration and bearing the evidence about this. So these are major things that the president has been doing. And if the Republicans want to, at the end, take credit, fine, but at least the people got what they wanted. The tariffs, I think, first of all, Michael's way disproportionate on the tariffs. If you look at the amount of revenue involved with the tariffs, it's like one of these deregulations. It's fairly small. Now, do you remember the Reagan trade war? I don't either. If you heard Reagan talk about free trade, it's so beautiful. It literally brings tears to my eyes to hear Reagan talk about trade. But I explain in the book that once I wiped the tears away and actually look at what Reagan did, Reagan was every bit as protectionist as Trump. Okay, so does that mean that protectionism is populist or a Republican? I don't know. Reagan is like the iconic Republican. He was so protectionist. What he did different, and the reason there weren't Reagan trade wars, is he did quotas. He protected the industries with quotas rather than tariffs, which means that the revenue, the extra money consumers pay, goes to the foreign companies rather than to our treasury. That's the big difference. Reagan had a very similar, in those days it was Japan and today it's China, but otherwise it was the same thing. Intellectual property problems in Japan and other places in East Asia. That Reagan was threatening tariffs, threatening protectionism, and delivered this number of quotas to try to deal with that. And in his second term, Reagan got the Japanese and some other East Asian countries to agree to some intellectual property protections, copyrights, and so on. Same thing going on with Trump. In fact, Trump has a lot of the Reagan people. Lighthizer is the lead trade guy now. He was the #2 trade guy in Reagan. You have Kudlow there from Reagan. You have the speechwriter who worked on Bring Down That Wall. He was there. So there's a lot of the same people. Protectionism, I think, is a bipartisan affair that has been around long before populism. Michael, I would recommend look at the tariff list. Download Lighthizer's tariff list and just take a look at what's there, okay? The stuff you're talking about is tiny, even relative to that list. We have a number of really outright import prohibitions that have been around my entire lifetime where there's been no populist president. You can't make pickup trucks in a foreign country because there's a massive tariff on it that's been there forever. And Obama and Bush never once dreamed about eliminating it. In fact, they promised another prohibition. We have import prohibitions, the Jones Act. Bush, Obama, Reagan, they all promised the special interests that we're going to keep that prohibition on importing coastal shipping services. Trump is the first one who has not promised to that lobby that he will keep it. In fact, as I explained in the book, he tries and so far has failed to get rid of it, but he is not telling the special interest that they can keep that. So I think to settle this debate, I think we need to be grounded in what's actually said and what's actually what the actual policies are. And these are busy people. They have lots of things they say and lots of things they do. But I think as quantitative social scientists, we have ways to bring that together. And I think you'll see a different picture.
Mike, do you agree with Casey that the trade war, maybe it was good, maybe it's bad, maybe it's not nearly as important as what you make it out to be, particularly versus some of what Casey views as successes?
No, I don't. But let me offer an area of agreement. I mean, I agree with Casey on the historical record that Republican presidents have imposed trade protections. There's no question about that. President Bush did. President Reagan did as well. But the general direction of U.S. trade policy under both Republicans and Democrats for decades and decades has been toward greater openness and greater globalization and fewer barriers to trade. That doesn't mean that there weren't ever protectionist policies put in place. That doesn't mean that we had a tariff-free world under President Bush and President Reagan, and then all of a sudden all the tariffs popped up under Democrats. But it does mean that the kind of protectionist global trade system that was in place decades and decades ago has dismantling that system has been a bipartisan project. Now, I think that successive presidents, starting with President Bush, President Obama, were more aggressive toward China and toward their trade practices. That was wholly justified. And I believe that if Mrs. Clinton had won in 2016, she would have been more aggressive toward China than President Obama was, and that she should have been. And if Mitt Romney were president in 2016, he would have been more aggressive toward China than President Obama was. What makes the president stand out is his hostility toward that entire regime, his hostility toward free trade in general. And instead of rallying an international coalition of our trading partners to isolate China and to crack down on China's genuine and legitimate trade abuses, the president imposed tariffs on our European allies, imposed tariffs on our Canadian allies, talked about pulling out of NATO and all these things. And so the president was left without allies, which has made his policies toward China much, much less effective than they could have been or than they should have been. The president's basic illiteracy about trade, not understanding what trade deficits are and what they are not, his adherence toward a mercantilist view of trade that's rejected by all economists or nearly all economists, has, I think, been unique. And these are distinctly populist elements of the president's approach to trade policy that I don't think can be accurately characterized as being in keeping with the direction of trade policy under presidents of both parties, and that I think do represent an aberration from what we've seen previously.
You have a response to that, Casey?
I think we look at the numbers. I don't think you're going to see Trump being an aberration relative to Reagan. As long as you distinguish tariff from quotas, okay? If you go out and measure tariffs under Reagan, you're not going to see a lot. He threatened some. He didn't do them. He did the quotas instead. But I don't know an economist who's like, oh, the quotas is much better than the tariffs. Let's give the money to the foreign companies. That's why he didn't get a trade war, by the way. Reagan was giving money to the Japanese companies while he was protecting our domestic companies. So of course the Japanese didn't fight back. In fact, people and CEA folks from the Reagan administration have told me the Japanese companies came into the White House and asked for quotas, and Reagan gave it to them. And I applaud Trump for it. I don't like protectionism, but if you're going to do protectionism, at least do it in a way that brings revenue to the United States instead of the foreign companies.
All right. I just want to get off trade just for a second, unless Mike has something to say. I think a lot of people, if they think about populist policy, they would certainly talk about trade and the trade war. And as someone who watched a lot of Trump rallies back in 2015, 2016, my impression that trade was a pretty big part of Trumponomics, and also immigration. What do you think Trump's policies on immigration, Casey, have been good ideas? And would you like to see them continued in future administrations or even extended?
I'm sharing it. I'm sharing a screen here. There's a picture from of the president announcing his immigration plan. I don't know if anybody was aware of what his plan is. His plan, essentially the Canadian and Australian plans, which is that immigration should be legal, not illegal, and based on economic contribution of the immigrant. That was his plan. Privately, what the president said, he actually opened this Rose Garden ceremony by saying, citizenship is the most precious thing America has to offer. Privately, he said that too. He went the next step, which really amazed and impressed me. He said, you know, we ought to be selling citizenship, which of course was what Gary Becker called his radical proposal for immigration reform would be to have a fee for immigration. Now, the president is a good politician and he knows he's not going to go out and try to sell that to Congress. But the Canadian and Australian system, their point-based system, is kind of a central planned way to try and imitate what a fee-based system would deliver. So now, of course, Congress ain't going to do anything that the president wants in immigration. So maybe you'd say this is not that meaningful. This is his plan, and this would be his chance to do demonstrative acts rather than substantive acts. And his plan was the Canadian and Australian plan, which is a kind of an approximation to the Gary Becker plan. So I was quite impressed with what the president does on immigration in terms of policy. You know, the rhetoric, that's not my area. You know, I'm a policy analyst. I'm not a speechwriter. But I look at the substance and I'm pretty impressed.
Mike, are you impressed by the president's immigration proposals or direction?
Well, I think in terms of the substance of that specific proposal, you know, I think there were a lot of questions about the details of that proposal, but the basic idea that we should have we should move a little closer toward a skills-based immigration system and a little bit away from a family-based immigration system, I think is completely sound. You know, I guess my own view is, you know, why not do both? Why not just have a significantly larger number of green cards awarded to highly skilled immigrants and just add that on top of what we're already doing? But, you know, that is a reasonable policy goal. Again, the details of the proposal, I think, were, you know, needed some work, but the overall kind of architecture and philosophy behind it, I think was reasonable. I agree with Casey about that. I don't think we should judge the entirety of the president's work on immigration based on that one proposal. And again, going back to the question of whether Trumpian populism has succeeded or failed, you know, a big part of the reason why that didn't get any traction is because the president has no credibility on this issue because of his extreme hostility toward immigrants and toward immigration. You know, the travel ban on people from some Muslim majority nations, you know, set the tone early in the administration on this. You know, all the way up until the pandemic, when the Trump administration attempted to say to people who were here on student visas that if you can't attend class in person, you have to go back to your home country, which was just outrageous public policy. You know, the last 4 years have really been kind of littered with that type of thing. That has stopped any momentum, any possibility of meaningful legislation on immigration while President Trump is president, even on issues where the kind of, you know, 30,000 foot structure the president is advocating is completely reasonable, you know, even if obviously still debatable. And so, you know, I would say, has Trumpian populism succeeded on immigration? No, it hasn't. a big, or I'm sorry, has President Trump succeeded on immigration? No, he hasn't. And a big part of that is, maybe even most of it, is because of the populist elements of his posture toward immigration.
You have a response, Casey, or we can move on?
Yeah, I think we should move on. I mean, these are interesting subjects, but we should treat them proportionally, which is not disproportionately by spending the whole day on that.
You know, another definition of populism is sort of a kind of politics and policy that just doesn't believe in constraints, and maybe not trade-offs either. And Republicans used to be very concerned about budget deficits and entitlements. That has not been a big part of Trumpian populism so far. Will that continue to be a part of Trumpian populism? We just don't worry about debts and deficits and entitlements. That's for the other party to worry about, I guess, when they get in power.
Trumpian populism, I think you're right. I've heard the president say, oh, you know, the government revenue machine, we just spin that massive wheel a little bit faster. He's not real concerned about the deficit. Now,
do you view that as a failure? Do you do that as I mean, it's gone up a lot, right?
Yeah, I view that as a failure. Now, ultimately, the fundamentals here are generational equity. But that's the fundamental thing. I mean, the problem with the big debt is you're leaving on the children and the grandchildren, right? And so I would want to put on my Kotlikov hat here. I would like to take a more holistic view of generational policy here. So COVID would factor into that. You know, how are we treating the children versus the older people, and those sort of trade-offs. I don't know that he's that unusual in terms of generational inequity compared to past presidents on the whole, but certainly in that specific area of treasury bonds and bills, he would be putting the burden on the future generations.
Has this been a problem, Mike? The lack of interest or concern in the national debt, which seemed to be a big concern when it was smaller.
Yeah, I think it's been a problem. I mean, here I would, I guess I would let the president off the hook a little bit. You know, I think that that there's bipartisan concern about the debt and deficit. It's just never the number one concern that either party has. You know, of course, it's true that President Trump significantly increased the structural budget deficit. He did that hand in glove with House Speaker Paul Ryan, who is a very kind of establishment traditional Republican, and there was not a whole lot of concern about that from the Republican Party at the time. The deficit went up significantly under President George W. Bush, who established an additional entitlement program without a funding mechanism. Of course, the deficit went up under President Obama as well. So this is a bipartisan issue. I think where populism shows up in President Trump's approach to the debt and deficit, which is I think an aberration among Republican presidents, is the president's enthusiasm for not cutting projected future spending on Social Security and Medicare. The Romney-Ryan campaign back in 2012 had that on their campaign website as a goal, and of course, Speaker Ryan made his reputation in large part on restraining entitlement spending. President Trump, not only just ignored that and put it in the background, but actually was quite vocal that he would not reduce spending on Medicare, he would not reduce spending on Social Security during the 2016 campaign, and then when he was actually in office in 2017, continued to make it very clear that he just wasn't interested in cutting future spending on those programs. Maybe that's populism, maybe that's smart politics, maybe that's just honesty, and that's I think that remains, that's an open question, but but I don't, I wouldn't give President Trump a particularly harsh grade when grading on a curve on this. And I don't view this as a major manifestation of his populism.
I have a question from Twitter, and that is, if President Trump is defeated, how will populism on the right change? Start with Casey.
That's like asking when we got the BlackBerry, what's coming next?
So yeah, so you're ready for this one. What comes after? Is it the iPhone or is it the?
It'd be something better. How is it better? I mean, I would be the billionaire if I knew exactly how to improve on it. But I think the populism will remain. They will look at Trump closely and try to figure out what he did well and what can be improved. And I think it's going to go back to the elites are making mistakes and they're not acknowledging these mistakes, and the people don't have to tolerate that. Most of Michael's book I agree with. The progress has been great for wide swaths of the population, but that doesn't mean that people have to tolerate these kind of mistakes from the people they elect. They elect the people to do a job, and if they're not doing it well and their subordinates are not doing it well, they have a right to be angry, and they are angry. And the book is full of examples where they didn't do a good job. The individual mandate was a terrible job. The opioid policies been a terrible job, continue to be a terrible job. And people are going to be upset with that. And the next entrepreneur will figure out how to take on the elite and still try to do the job as president. It's not easy because the elite fight back. I mean, the elite aren't stupid people. They're not powerless people. So it's not an easy product to invent, but I'm confident that somebody will invent a new and improved.
And Mike, how do you think populism on the right evolves? We've talked a lot about trade, and I'm a little confused about what Republicans think about trade. On one hand, they're talking about sort of decoupling the two economies, but yet the phase one trade deal actually in many ways more firmly integrated the two economies, made China a better place to invest. More agricultural goods being so I'm particularly maybe on trade, or I guess any other issue you want to address. How does that populism on the right evolve in a post-Trump era?
Well, I think so. I guess the first thing I would say is I think it does evolve. I think it evolves a lot less than is commonly believed. I mean, I think the United States was on the cusp of extinguishing this populist flame when the pandemic hit. And I would note that the Democratic Party nominated Vice President Biden when it could have nominated Senator Sanders or Senator Warren, both of whom are populists. And, I mean, who knows? But my guess is that if the Democratic primaries were held 1 year earlier, when the economy was still weaker, and when the gains from the recovery hadn't reached everyone in the nation as strongly yet, that one of the populist candidates would have had perhaps more success. There's a pattern, and you see it over the last century, even longer, and you see it across democracies, which is that when you have a big recession that originated in the financial sector, and that results in widespread hardship, you get a surge in populism, and you can measure that by seats in the country's legislature and parliamentary systems. We saw this, in Britain with Boris Johnson, for example. And then as the recovery continues from that recession, populism recedes. And populism was receding in the United States, and now, of course, we have the pandemic, and the economy is in terrible shape again. So, my first answer to your question is that I think as we recover from this recession, populism will may surge again because we're in terrible shape. But when we get back to a healthy economy, its influence will diminish. But I do think there will be some lasting elements of this. Some of those elements are good. I think that, and I hope that the Republican Party, because of President Trump, is more focused on providing economic opportunity to lower income households and workers than it previously has been. that would be a good lesson learned. I hope it's not just the white working class. I hope it's the entire, bottom 20% or bottom third of the income distribution. But I think that would be a positive, lasting legacy of the president's populism. I think a hawkishness toward China is going to be something that justifiably should continue to be a part of the political right. Hopefully, it's executed better than the Trump administration has done, but I would expect that would last. And then, unfortunately, I think that that hostility toward immigrants and immigration is going to be is going to have some staying power on the political right, and I think that will accrue to the detriment of the United States.
I have another
Michael,
Twitter. Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead,
Michael, is there something missing from your definition in mine that would make, because our definitions are about the elite versus the people, but you were calling Sanders and Warren populists, but their whole policy agenda is to give more power to the elite over the people. So what gives?
Yeah, they don't see it that way. They don't see it that way. But I understand your analysis of that.
I have a question from @JimPethakoukas, Twitter. That's me. One thing
Are you asking this question?
I am asking this question from myself, but as someone from Twitter.
That was clever phrasing.
Yeah, it was clever phrasing. We're it's the end. All rules are off. What I don't know necessarily about you, Casey, or about the president, but when I hear a lot of these new Trumpian populist policy people on the right, when they talk about the big elite policy mistakes, the two mistakes that come up over and over again are giving China permanent most favored nation trading status, kind of letting them be part of the global economy in 2000. And then the 1965 Immigration Act, which increased immigration to the United States from areas where we weren't getting a lot of immigrants. Do you view those as failures of elites, letting more immigrants into this country and helping China become a more integrated part of the global economy?
Well, there were elements of failure. I mean, where was the fentanyl coming from? There was a report the Clinton administration did around NAFTA about what that did to the price of heroin that is classified. You and I can't see it. They buried those facts. So there were elements of real cost to some of these trade arrangements that weren't acknowledged. Doesn't mean there weren't benefits. Maybe the benefits are bigger, but they're sweeping.
Do you think it's a net benefit, China? Do you think that was still a net benefit to have China being a greater part of the global economy?
It's hard to me to analyze. With Japan, it would be easy for me to say, yeah, because Japan's a democracy, doesn't have military. There's a whole national security part of it that it's not my expertise. I really can't weigh in. It has to be weighed in. On an immigration, I'm coming from a university, so you shouldn't listen to what I'm going to say, but the university sector has been given a lot of special favors around immigration. And you could understand why the people would say, the academia hates us and they hate this president. Why are we giving you these special favors? And so that's a problem. Not that I'm against more immigration, but when the immigration is doled out to special interests, the rights to immigration are doled out to special interests, that I would question. And then that's kind of what I see keeping the fuel going, even within Trump's administration in terms of pushing against some of these old immigration plans and deals.
All right, we're just about to end. Mike, any final comment?
Just to thank Casey for writing this book and to encourage everybody who's tuning in to buy it. It really is very thoughtful, and these are complicated issues that admit quite a bit of reasonable disagreement, and I would encourage everybody to read Casey's perspective on this. All right,
Casey, I didn't actually give you an official last comment, so this would be your opportunity.
No, I agree with Michael. And Michael, it's interesting to have the two books side by side. I think you'll learn a lot more. The sum is better than the parts. The sum is greater than the parts. So this issue is not going away, so it's worth learning about and investing in.
Great, thanks a lot. All right, and that's it for the AI event. Thanks for watching.